All right, well, it's an honor to be here this morning. I was delighted to get the invitation from John several months back. I am trained as a clinical psychologist, so my Ph.D. is in, but my work has not largely been published in clinical psychology outlets. If you do a quick search of the literature, there's less work on racism-related stress relative to developmental psychology or counseling psychology. And so anytime I have an opportunity to speak with a clinical psychology audience, I'm very excited to have the opportunity to do so. So very glad to be here this morning. Here's a roadmap for how I'd like to spend our time together this morning. I'm going to start out with a little bit of background and motivation for why I'm interested in this topic and how I'm thinking about it. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about what we know about racism-related stress as a risk factor for African American youth. And then I want to talk a little bit about how we mitigate the impact of racism-related stress on mental health. Much of the work that I do centers on racial and ethnic protective factors. So we're going to talk about what are some of the factors that research shows protect youth against the impact of race-related stress, racism-related stress over time. I'll then shift to talk a little bit about my thinking and others' thinking around CBT approaches for racism-related stress. I see there's a workshop on Friday afternoon which will also speak to that. And we really don't know a lot in this area, but I'll tell you a little bit about how folks are talking about it. And then I'll conclude by talking just about recommendations and future directions for the field. As I mentioned earlier to someone, the longer you've been doing this, you don't time yourself anymore, so I have no idea how long this will last, and I'll adjust as we go along. On June 6th, 2015, the case of Kalief Browder, a 22-year-old African-American male who served time in prison for a crime that he was falsely accused of at the age of 16, reignited a national conversation around racism and mental health. Just a few weeks prior, perhaps more importantly, let me tell you a little bit about what happened and what reignited the conversation. Kalief Browder went into a bedroom, pulled out the air conditioning, and then pushed himself through the hole with a cord wrapped around his neck. Just a few weeks prior, there was a publication in the Journal of American Medical Association Pediatrics, which reported that there was an increase and doubling in the suicide rates of Black children since the 1990s, highlighting some concern for this population and Black mental health in a population which until recently had not been known for high suicide rates. Recent statistics, empirical evidence, and headlines paint a mixed picture of the mental health of African American youth, children and adolescents. Let me read you a few headlines. Racism impacts mental health of teens. Discrimination associated with mental health woes in Black teens. Racism is harmful to your mental health. There are many other headlines such as these. Frequently when I give talks such as these, I'll search racism and mental health or health and hit the news button, and there's always plenty that comes up, unfortunately. When we think about statistics, we know that African American children are disproportionately impoverished. So 1/3 of African American children live in poverty. We know that that's an important risk factor for poor mental health outcomes. There's been a lot of conversation around suspension rates for African American preschool children. So several studies have reported disproportionate suspension rates for preschool children that far exceed the rates of their representation among enrolled preschool children. At the same time, there is evidence that African American children and adolescents are resilient, and there's evidence of their psychological fortitude. Okay, so several studies document higher levels of self-esteem for African American students and children relative to their white counterparts. These data here are frequently cited from the Caring for Children in the Community study. These were rural North Carolina students. We don't have a large base in terms of epidemiological data, but what the data largely show and what folks are aware of is that when you look at mental health disorders, African American children and adolescents, rates of psychopathology are comparable with their white counterparts. In some cases, like depressive disorders, for example, they actually have lower rates. And this has been somewhat of an enigma because, as many of you probably know, when you look at racial health disparities in terms of physical health, we see quite a different picture. Nonetheless, this suggests that there is some evidence that African American children evidence some resiliency. And so these are the kinds of things that people have tried to understand. Why might it be that they're on parity in terms of mental health outcomes, but then when you look at the severity, you see some discrepancies there. So a mixed picture, for sure. Interest in the mental health of African American youth has a long history in both theoretical and empirical scholarship. How many of you are familiar with the Kenneth Clark-Doll studies? Okay, so a mixed group here. So the Clark-Doll experiments were done quite a while ago. Kenneth and Mamie Clark, well-known African American psychologists. Dr. Ken Clark is one of the only African American presidents of the American Psychological Association. In that study, Clark showed African American children dolls and asked them to pick the doll that looked most like them. They also asked them to pick which doll, showing a black and a white doll, was the good doll, and a number of other characteristics. And many of the black children picked the white doll as associated with positive characteristics, and the black doll as bad, negative, etc. Okay, it looks like there's a question.
There is a question, and I don't know if you know the answer. Did it matter the race of the person presenting the dolls?
I do not know the answer to that.
Because I'm looking at this, that there's a obviously white person presenting the dolls. So I'm wondering if that was a fact.
Okay. Yeah, that is a great question. It actually leads to a larger point. It's actually, in terms of the larger point I'm trying to make, that detail is perhaps consistent. And that idea is that people initially interpreted the study as showing that black children had low self-esteem. And what we now eventually got to the point where we recognized there are a lot of different things that could be going on with why children may have picked the black doll as not being the good doll, and that there are a lot of methodological issues that we'd have to tend to, one of which was just asked. So the general picture from the studies is that, there's something going on. Why are the black children, sort of picking the black doll as a negative doll? But it doesn't indicate that they are all damaged and have poor self-esteem. And as I mentioned earlier, many studies actually show that African American children don't have lower self-esteem, okay? Some of the other things I have on the slide, the picture card replication, there was some work on CNN with Anderson Cooper a few years back where they did a similar study. Again, I don't know the specifics, with Margaret Beale Spencer, a noted developmental psychologist, where she had picture cards that showed these pictures. And again, the African American children picked and associated positive characteristics with the white pictures of the children and negative characteristics with the doll. Okay, some of the reasons, leading reasons people kind of think may be going on have to do with how folks are socialized, and that you can be socialized in a particular way. Our society tells you from very young that black is terrible and white is good, but that can be separate from your self-esteem. Consistent with this sort of attention to the resiliency of Black youth, there was an APA task force dedicated to resilience and strength in African American children, which really noticed that moving beyond sort of a deficit perspective and associating or thinking of Black children as having these low self-esteem, that there are in fact strengths and that these children are resilient. Okay, so although it's clear that there are numerous risk factors that may account for the mental health of African American children, one of the leading factors and a significant focus of recent literature has begun to focus on racism and racism-related stress. This work across a couple different fields, mainly you won't see a whole lot of it in clinical psych, but public health has kind of led the field here, developmental psychology, and they've really conceptualized racism as a psychosocial stressor that has a negative impact on health, okay? So some of the ways that can happen, racism can lead to truncated socioeconomic mobility, difference in access to education, difference to ability, job opportunities, for parents, which may have implications for raising their children. And being in poor living conditions, we know is associated with negative mental health outcomes. Another mechanism that many scholars have talked about is that discrimination induces physiological and psychological changes that, if you begin to have health problems, going to be linked with your health status and how you feel about yourself. So some links there in terms of mental health. And then this notion that racism-related stress can impact the self-esteem of some Black youth and possibly damage their self-concept. So we know on a large scale that that's not the case, that all Black children have low self-esteem. But there is this idea that for some Black youth, they internalize these negative views of self, which in turn has implications for their mental health. Okay, the next set of slides shows a couple of conceptual models and frameworks. I'm not going to go into the specifics of every model, but I'll highlight a couple of things. One of the landmark sort of conceptual frameworks in the field is the biopsychosocial model of racism by Rodney Clark and colleagues in 1999. And in that model, Clark really conceptualized racism, again, as a psychosocial stressor that leads to exaggerated psychological and physiological responses, and that over time, that exaggerated physiological and psychological response leads to poor mental health and physical health outcomes, okay? There's a lot of talk about how this gets under the body, although it's not as developmental as I would like to see it. But that literature talks about how the physiological activation of the body from the psychological stress of racism activates the nervous system, activates the sympathetic nervous system, and that over time, allostatic load, it just wears down the body over the time such that it cannot respond to later assaults in the developmental course. Okay. Another model taken from the public health literature suggests that race really positions you to experience institutional racism, cultural racism, and that over time this leads to increased stress that leads to, again, psychological responses, internalized racism, negative self-esteem, stereotype threat, and that over time this really, again, as I said, this is just a more complex model, leads to negative mental health and physical health outcomes. You'll notice that these models don't have a particularly developmental characteristic to them, but there has been some work in developmental psychology, some of Cynthia Garcia-Cole's work, which says racism is a major factor. If you're going to study the adjustment outcomes of African American and racial and ethnic minority youth, you've got to consider the role of racial discrimination just by the fact that you belong to a racial or ethnic minority group. That sets the stage for racism, oppression, and it's really relevant in terms of how family processes play out, other characteristics that lead to how a youth develops over time. Okay, eco-social theories, Nancy Krieger's work. What's been exciting about this work is a lot of these models are starting to look at, and you see what I've circled there, the life course, and recognizing that this plays out over time. Okay? Here's another model, Gilgee's work at UCLA, suggesting that racism isn't just these individual, sort of someone calling someone a racial epithet, but that we've really got to start thinking about the role of institutional factors, institutional racism, cultural racism, and that if you don't have access to the same educational resources, that sets the stage for problems over the life course. Okay? And you see at the end there a disparity in life expectancy that really starts quite early on in development. Okay, so before I go any further, I just want to review a couple of terms. I talk about prejudice and racism often, so I kind of know the definitions I have for them. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. I use the definitions from James Jones's classic work, Prejudice and Racism. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to check it out. It's been reprinted a number of times. But in that book, Jones talks about racism as an exercise of power against a racial group that's defined as inferior. And he says that that exercise of power consists of two elements. Those are prejudice, that individuals have negative attitudes or beliefs that they then extend or behave or discriminate towards other individuals. So differential treatment discrimination is kind of the behavioral extension of the underlying prejudicial attitudes. So many racism scholars think of racism as prejudice plus discrimination plus an element of power. Another way that he talked about racism, which is really important in terms of some of the things that I mentioned, is that there are different levels of racism. So individual racism is the one that we spend a lot of time thinking about. Kids who come in and sort of report that someone called them a racial epithet. That would be the belief that another group is inferior and the behavioral enactment. Jones said that individual racism is kind of interchangeable with racial discrimination. But increasingly scholars have said, again, institutional racism is really important to zero in on. Institutional racism refers to the sometimes conscious manipulation of institutions, or it doesn't have to be conscious. It can be the byproduct of any practices that impinge on the rights and access of particular groups, okay? So there's been extensive conversations, in fact, going back to the case of Kalief Browder, about incarceration and segregation as critical institutional racism factors that kind of keep the playing field from being level, okay? Another type of racism that hasn't got as much attention is something called cultural racism, okay? Jones argued that racism is manifest in the symbols and it's manifest in language. So things like a Confederate statue send a message that suggests the superiority of one culture over another. Yes?
My question is this. By labeling institutional racism as conscious or unconscious, doesn't that take the responsibility off of the one with the power, who is, the one who's manifesting the racism? Doesn't making it unconscious take the responsibility off of that individual?
Okay, the question is, does labeling institutional racism as conscious or unconscious take the responsibility off of others? And my quick response to that is that I think that argument could certainly be made. Right now I'm just kind of presenting what the classic definitions in the field are, but I think one could make that argument. Okay, so going back to cultural racism, symbols, heritage, there have been some really interesting work that suggests that if you do content analysis of media and look at TV programs, which a lot of youth are paying attention to, that there's actually more negative nonverbal cues and negative energy towards African Americans on TV. And so the suggestion has been that this is, media cultural representations that children pick up on as they watch these very subtle cues. Okay, there's no one kind of saying, black people are bad or whatever, but if you're kind of watching a media that shows negative reactions to African Americans, that may have an impact. Okay, this is a classic model, the tripartite model of racism. There are many other forms of racism, which I'll mention in a second. It looks like there's another question.
If racism is about power, is there such a thing as reverse racism? If the group that's being oppressed doesn't have the power, how can it be reverse racism?
The question very quickly was, can there be reverse racism, which as a racism researcher I get all the time. And the quick answer is that depends who you talk to. So if you define racism as having an element of power, some have argued that people who are not in a position of power cannot be racist. There are some who argue that's ridiculous. Anyone can be racist. I'm not going to go into, we're not going to be probably able to resolve that in the next couple minutes, but that's the discussion there. Okay, so we know what these different terms mean. Naomi Priest published several years ago, a researcher in Australia, which does some really cool work on racism and young people with Aboriginal populations there. Her team wrote a systematic review looking at the link between racism and well-being for young people. And they looked at pretty much any type of well-being outcome you can think of: mental health status, life satisfaction, quality of life, et cetera. In young people, looked at about 500 such associations. And what they found was that there's a link between discrimination and poor well-being. Many of these studies were cross-sectional, but she reported that upwards of at least 80% of the studies found some kind of association. We know that racial discrimination is a common experience for African American youth and young adults, and several studies that have looked at this. And part of the reason that this, I've argued for more developmental framing and thinking about racism-related stress is that adolescence and the transition to adulthood is a really critical period for becoming aware. You're kind of grappling with your identity. You're kind of coming to the awareness that, wow, other people may not see my group in a favorable way. And as you become more aware of this and trying to figure out what your place is in society, and as the incidence of discrimination experiences increases, it's a pretty likely time that youth are going to come in reporting that they're having some trouble with these types of experiences. So racial discrimination is associated with a host of deleterious mental health outcomes. If you name a mental health outcome, there's probably a study showing a negative association with racial discrimination. And youth are thinking about racial discrimination in many different ways. So I presented to you kind of the classic definitions in some work we're doing right now in Southeast Raleigh with African American youth there. Said to them, this was a few months back, do you think racism has changed? What does it look like now? And the children said, we think it's more subtle than what our parents talk about. As a racism researcher, that wasn't terribly surprising. There have been a lot of discussions around racism being more subtle and kind of more microaggressions now, micro-invalidations. But really was interesting to me when I asked the youth to talk a little bit more about that, as they said, they don't call you names anymore. It's nonverbal cues. It's how our teachers kind of talk to us. When I go to school every day, my teachers actually talk slower to me when they are explaining something than they do to the other students. When my teachers talk to me, they kind of lean in and as they slow their speech and speak in ways that make me feel like I'm stupid, okay? And what was perhaps surprising to me, it may not be surprising to folks in here, is that the kids were picking up on these very subtle nuances and reporting that on a daily basis, this made them feel pretty badly about themselves, okay? They gave other examples. They said, we have a school dress code. The principal of the school differentially, enforces the dress code. The black students seem to be disproportionately disciplined for not following the dress code. White students can do other violations, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. Another young teen said, I remember a couple years ago when I took a test for getting into a sort of gifted and talented program, I missed the cutoff by 2 points. There was another white friend of mine who missed it by 4 points, and she was still admitted into the program, and I don't understand why that happened. She reported that this made her really upset and anxious, and she never really sort of came to terms with why she wasn't selected for the program. So these are the kinds of things that black youth are talking about. In terms of what we know about how racial discrimination leads to negative mental health outcomes, there's not a whole lot of longitudinal work that's been done, but there is some good work by Jean Brody, which has talked about lower school engagement. There's work linking racial discrimination with greater affiliation with peers who use substances. Some work by Fred Gibbons has suggested that racial discrimination over time leads to decreased self-control. There are a number of studies also showing racial discrimination leading to increased anger, and that in turn being associated with greater willingness to use substances when under duress. We're writing the study up right now. Another really interesting study. These are teens, again, African-American teens that we looked at over a period of 2 years. And what we found is that higher experiences of discrimination led to a decrease in their social networks, so the number of friends that they reported having. And lower social support was in turn associated with increased psychological distress, okay? So, from a clinical perspective, kind of thinking about the fact that these experiences may lead to lower numbers of friends, and why that may be the case. Are people withdrawing from their social interactions? But we know that lower social support is a risk factor for internalizing and other types of problems, and so thinking about what may be going on there. There's a plethora of hypotheses about what may be going on. Some have talked about increased vigilance, maybe being surveilled, may lead to sort of heightened feelings of anxiety, police surveillance, that black youth may be experiencing more trauma than they did, but we really don't know. This is a lot of speculation other than the few studies that I've already mentioned. Okay, so that's I don't know about a crash course, but kind of where the field is in terms of the link between racism-related stress and black youth health. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about a resilience perspective. I think it's pretty clear that there's a link between racism-related stress and poor health. We're still trying to understand why that's the case. But if that were all I studied, I'd be pretty depressed myself. And so over the years, what our work has focused on is trying to understand what are the racial and ethnic and cultural resources and protective factors that black youth have that may mitigate or attenuate the negative impact of racism-related stress and some of those experiences that I described a while ago. So there is evidence that race, ethnic, and culturally relevant experiences can moderate the relationship between racism and psychological adjustment. Some of the factors we look at in our work, and I'll tell you a little bit, are about our ethnic racial identity. How does a youth define themselves in terms of belonging to an African-American racial group, okay? How important is being black? What does it mean to be black, et cetera? So I'll say more about that. Another factor we've looked at in our work is racial socialization. How do black parents talk to their children about race? How do they talk to them about coping with racism? Okay? In this work that we've done in Southeast Raleigh, the parents are coming in and they're saying, we really don't know how to talk to our kids about these experiences. We really need some help in how we have conversations around the table to help them negotiate these experiences with racism. Okay, and so we'll talk about the role of racial socialization. Another less studied factor is something called Afrocentric worldview. This is the endorsement or sort of belief in certain African values, so things like spirituality, things like communalism, things like orality, so the oral tradition, things of that nature that may actually, again, mitigate the impact of stress on negative mental health outcomes. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. All three of these factors have been associated with both positive and negative mental health correlates. And the next set of slides will just give you kind of some snapshot views of how we've looked at this in our work. Okay, so racial identity. How important is being Black to who you are? This is a study we did with late teens, so probably 18 and 19-year-olds, where we asked them about their discrimination experiences, which is what's on the x-axis, and then we looked at psychological distress. The question we had is, does how central your race is to you, so how important it is to you, mitigate the impact of discrimination, okay? And what we found in this study, which was quite some time ago, was that racial identity buffers or mitigates the association between discrimination and anxiety, depressive symptoms. We looked at perceived stress as well. So if you look at these charts here, you'll see that there's generally a positive association between racial discrimination and negative mental health outcomes, but not for people who have high racial centrality. So the youth who said being Black is really important to who I am, there was no association between discrimination and mental health outcomes. One thing students always ask me about when I show these charts is that you'll notice the folks who had medium levels of centrality, so the middle group in terms of feeling like being Black is important, have a positive association, but they also have the highest levels of psychological distress. Interesting finding, and perhaps a sort of harbinger of some subsequent work I'm going to tell you about in a second. But the main point I focus on is that there is a positive association, even for a group that says, yeah, being Black is pretty important to who I am. Okay, in some subsequent work that we've done, we ran into a couple of surprises, okay? So when we looked at people who said being Black is really important to who I am, we found that it was actually associated with more negative mood, okay? So in one study where we had folks come in and imagine these different racism vignettes, and we looked at their levels of racial identity, we found that it was actually the people who had the highest levels of centrality who reported being the most angry and disgusted, okay? So this fits with that Gibbons work that I told you, racial discrimination leads to, kind of more anger or negative affect. But what was surprising about this is in the research literature, if you take a look at it, by and large, racial identity is thought to be a protective factor. And so we were thinking, okay, well, if it's protective, why would it be the case that individuals are reporting higher levels of negative affect when they experience these racism events? We also found when we kind of looked at blatant instances of racism and subtle instances of racism, that it was the subtle instances of racism where individuals who had higher levels of centrality, so who said being Black is really important, actually had more just affective reactivity, so higher positive and negative, sort of responses to subtle instances of racism. And so again, we were kind of like, if this is protective, and we know that negative affect is associated with negative health outcomes, mental health outcomes, how could we explain this discrepancy, okay? I don't have slides for this, but I'll tell you in our most recent work, what we're finding, again, these are adolescent sample, late teens, is that individuals who are most identified with their racial group are actually reporting higher levels of anxiety and psychological distress over time when they experience discrimination, okay? This, again, is not consistent with the idea that racial discrimination or racial identity is a protective factor, okay? And so the question that is keeping me awake a little bit at night right now is, why is it the case that folks who say being Black is really important to me are having these heightened psychological distress experiences, okay? Before I tell you some of our ideas there, I'll let you think about it for a bit. Okay, the second factor I mentioned is racial socialization. How do Black parents talk to their kids about race, okay? I don't have time to review the entire racial socialization literature, but there are a couple of different things the literature has said about how Black parents tend to do this. One is racial pride messages. So Black parents tell their kids, be proud to be Black. Your race is, something you should be proud of. There's another type of message called barrier messages. These are parents who say to their kids, look, you're going to experience discrimination. You're going to have to try twice as hard, maybe even harder than that, to get the same results. There are barriers out there you will face, okay? And then there are other parents who, kind of say, we're not going to talk about discrimination, just work hard. Everyone's equal, we are all created equal, just go out there and do your best. And those are three of the most common messages that folks have talked about. And so what we did some time ago is we looked at whether how parents talk to their kids about race, whether their use of these different strategies and combining different strategies would mitigate or attenuate the link between discrimination and negative mental health outcomes, okay? This first slide here was just kind of looking at the main effects of discrimination over time. We looked at depressive symptoms, we looked at stress, we looked at problem behaviors, and what you see is that over time, discrimination was associated with negative mental health outcomes. In terms of the parental communications about race, we had a couple groups. We actually did a profile analysis where we combined the different messages that I just told you about, and we found that there are some parents who are really all about racial pride and the barrier messages. So they combine, be proud to be Black, you're going to have to try twice as hard. We call those groups positive socialization. So moderate positive and high positive are the folks who are, kind of telling their kids those messages. But we disturbingly also found two other groups. One group is the low frequency group, who really didn't talk to their kids about race at all when we looked at the different messages. And then there was another group that we found in about 20% of the sample that was actually telling their kids negative things about being African American, okay? So things like don't, hang out with the other Black children at school, being Black is not good, identify, you should do things that identify with basically being white, okay? When we look at the link between discrimination and perceived stress, what we found is that parents who are actively talking to their kids about race, telling them about barriers, telling them be proud to be Black, no association between discrimination and perceived stress, okay? If you look at the other groups, you notice as discrimination increases, their level of stress increases, okay? This was, it makes intuitive sense, but as a clinician, particularly when I was doing more active work with Black parents, A lot of them often would come in and say, I don't know if I should talk to my kid about this. I don't know when to talk to my kids about this. I know they're having some difficulty around it. Should I just not say anything? And after we did this study, we said, you absolutely should be talking to your kids about this. We also did a lot of work with schools that were saying, isn't a colorblind approach the way to go? And we said, well, if we kind of equate the kind of low frequency group with colorblind approaches, not saying anything about race actually, as youth experience discrimination, can relate to more negative mental health outcomes, okay? We found a similar kind of relation that suggests socialization is positive when we looked at discrimination and problem behaviors. So this was a measure looking at kids getting sent to the principal's office and other acting out behaviors. Obviously, and not surprisingly, the moderate negative group, the parents group whose parents were saying negative things about being African American, were getting in a lot more trouble as discrimination increased. They have the highest levels, as you can see there. And again, the positive messages, at least these data, are consistent with the idea that there's something protective about talking with kids about race, okay? So again, this kind of suggests, as you think about what treatment and how you might work with this, that having parent involvement and having conversations might be beneficial. Okay, I'll go through this last one somewhat quickly so we can pick up a little bit of speed here. But we've also looked at physiological outcomes in our work. Blood pressure, I also look at heart rate variability, some of the things that Tom mentioned earlier. Because we know there's a connection between mind and body, and we're thinking it may help us understand why is there this discrepancy for mental health epidemiology relative to physical health. And what we found in this study is that African American, first we looked at racial identity, and we found that individuals who kind of had what we call a low regard. This means that they have the view that other people don't see blacks favorably, that they were protected against the effects of discrimination on their blood pressure. So that triangle line, that's actually a negative association that showed that for this group, if I thought or had the view that other people in general don't see blacks favorably, and then the nationalist piece of it is that I think there's something unique to being black. As discrimination increased, my blood pressure actually decreased, okay? So this is a counterintuitive finding, but again, there's some notion that identity could influence, something psychological could influence the physiological realm. We also found, we asked the youth, to what extent do you put value in material possessions, clothes, money? Do you notice what other people wear? And we found that in kids who said they don't do that, they had more kind of spiritual and intrinsic self-valuing. There was no association between racial discrimination and blood pressure. For the kids who told us that they kind of notice what everyone's wearing and they want the latest, sneakers and, this, that, and the other, there was a very strong association, that's the line with the circles there on the right side, between racial discrimination and increased blood pressure. So for those kids who were concerned with those material possessions, as their discrimination experiences increased, so did their resting blood pressure. Okay, so really quickly, discrimination is bad. Racial identity, while protective in the context of racial discrimination, I'm always happy when I get a laugh when discussing about racism because it's such a heavy topic, so thank you for laughing. Racial identity, in the context of discrimination, appears that it can be protective, but it also is associated with negative affect, which is a risk for negative mental health. Parental conversations about about race can promote Black adolescent mental health. And then there's something about identity and African-centered values, so emphasizing spirituality, that can buffer the association between discrimination and blood pressure. Okay, a couple of interesting findings there. Okay, I want to think a little bit now about what does this mean and how we might actually use this in a CBT context? We don't really have a lot of information here. There's been a lot of discussion, as many of you know, about adaptations of evidence-based practice. The studies, some that have looked at trauma-focused CBT, group CBT, even multi-systemic therapy, the numbers are woefully low in terms of African American participants, great attrition rates. Some of the sample sizes are just, I don't want to say laughable, but just really concerning. And so it's really hard for us to know where do we go with this. That said, there are a number of people who've been writing about how we might think about this, and so a couple ideas here. Monica Williams, well-known OCD researcher at UConn, wrote a paper about thinking about CBT, and in it she talks quite a bit about CBT for youth and thinking about race-based adaptations. And one of the things she says in it is we've got to promote positive ethno-racial identity. So we've got to tell kids, be proud to be, give them a strong sense of their identity. We've got to think about what stage of identity we're at as clinicians. She says you've got to understand the theory and the models around how Black youth develop in terms of their identity. And you've got to engage them, again, to the extent relevant to the presenting problems, in an exploration of their identity. Discuss positive aspects of ethnic racial identity, okay? She also says, encourage the youth to learn about their group, encourage rejection of pathological stereotypes, and also encourage them to be involved in cultural activities. This framing is consistent with thinking about identity as a protective factor. What I'm beginning to grapple with a little bit is that I think there needs to be a little bit more nuanced discussion around how racial identity works for Black youth and really racial and ethnic minority youth. As I mentioned earlier, several studies kind of suggest that being African American and saying being Black is really important actually is linked with greater psychological distress, okay? We actually found, I haven't mentioned these data, but same study, longitudinal data, that Black youth who say being Black is really important to my identity report higher levels of vigilance around racism events. So I'm getting away from the mic here. They actually report that they start attending to where they're going to go. They plan their activity and schedules around where racism may occur. And so if heightened sense of identity is leading to heightened vigilance, negative affect, then promoting positive racial identity may be something we need to be thoughtful about how we do that, okay? And we need to understand that it may be a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, it may be a protective factor, but in particular settings or contexts, it might heighten vigilance, it might heighten sort of awareness of what's going on, okay? So my response, although I introduced promoting positive ethno-racial identity, is that stay tuned, okay? Okay, really nice paper in The Behavior Therapist a couple years ago about cultural sensitivity and CBT. Really quickly, they say, therapeutic stance is important. The therapist has got to understand, again, the identity models, the cultural experiences of the people that they're working with. They talk about how you've got to invite conversations about marginalized status. Do you think the anxiety that you're experiencing is because of the race of the people in your immediate context? As a conversation, they say, don't shy away from this stuff. I remember when I started at Penn State in the late 90s in child clinical program there was this discussion around should you have a conversation with the client that you're Black, okay? And I was like, well, I think they're gonna notice. But back then, there was a more kind of a discussion of should you do that, should you not, what are the pros and cons? Now, these folks say, just it's in the room, talk about it, okay? They talk about psychoeducation. These are anxiety researchers, so they say, when you're talking about how anxiety develops, don't just give a kind of sterile presentation of, pairing of this and that, but really tie it to the cultural experiences and the developmental history and things that have actually happened. There's been some evidence that, again, Black adults report that they enjoy this more, that they can connect with it a little bit more when you explain how anxiety develops using specific examples that they, sort of bring in during intake, those kinds of things. Perhaps one of the most interesting dimensions of their recommendations is around cognitive restructuring. They say, if folks come in and say, I think I may not have been served or treated in a particular way because of racism, you've got to be careful about the kinds of disputing questions that you might propose. So if a client says, I'm experiencing this, I think it was because racism, and you as a therapist say, well, are you 100% sure that it's racism? Or what are some other reasons that it might have happened? The client might experience that 10 minutes, okay, as a microaggression and as an micro-invalidation. And so they say instead of focusing on, sort of disputing questions about the racism itself, instead think about, negative thoughts the person may have. So if a client, for example, says, I feel that I'm stupid or not competent because of how people interact with me when I'm in my, my work, my job after school, that you might focus on the evidence around whether, evidence that counters the idea that they are stupid or not competent, okay? So it's very simple, it makes a lot of sense. And then exposure, as you might suggest, you can read the article, but they basically suggest that, you use knowledge of the culture to inform the types of exposures that individuals experience. I love this work. I think it's important. A lot of the work that has been done has not really been developmental in nature. So this might work, and a lot of the work on racism-related stress is on adolescents and early adults. But one of the things I want to think about a little bit more is what might this type of intervention look like for younger kids? How might we apply some of these principles? When I did my dissertation work at Michigan in the early 2000s, and we asked 7th and 8th graders, tell us about racial discrimination. They were like, what are you talking about? That's never happened to me. And then we would say, well, is there a time when someone treated you differently because of your race? And they would say, oh yeah, all the time, okay? So cognitively, in terms of how you understand and how you talk about racism is going to be different at earlier in development than it will be in high school. 10th grade, you really see folks, kind of saying, oh yeah. And so how do we apply some of these principles earlier on, there have been discussions, I have some thoughts around how we might have sort of integrate sort of a parent management kind of approach. But again, this is not well studied work. There's also been some work around thinking about safety plans for racism and working with Black adults. Again, so the focus is not on youth here, but I think we might begin to think about how you might develop a safety plan in the context of racism. So some work by Janet Helms and her colleagues out of Boston University said in the same way that we do safety and crisis planning for suicide, we might help the clients to develop a wellness toolbox, and these are a series of racism recovery steps. So helping the youth to understand how they feel when they're managing racism in a healthy manner. What are some ways that you can stay grounded, healthy, and connected when you experience racism? What are your triggers? What do you notice in terms of your experiences that tend to result in racial trauma types of symptoms? What are those symptoms? How do you feel? How do you know? Paying attention to body signals, physiological responses, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is steps if you want to take a look at it. I encourage you to, there's a hashtag, racial trauma is real. If you Google that, the paper will come up. It's an excellent tool. That, again, I think we'd have to think about how you would do this with a youth population, but an excellent starting point. Crisis planning, They actually suggest listing a person that you can contact if you experience something like this and you feel really distressed. Okay, so how do we go forward? What are some recommendations and future directions? We were delighted to have the opportunity, while Mitch Prinstein was editor of Journal of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology, to invite me and one of my graduate students to write a paper on where the field needs to go with regard to racism-related stress and youth mental health. I've selected some of the recommendations here from the paper, but there's a really nice table. I encourage you to check it out, Table 1. Elucidate the mechanisms and pathways. If we're going to develop interventions around treating racism-related stress, we've got to understand how racial discrimination leads to these negative mental health outcomes. And we've begun to do some of that work, but a lot of the work is still cross-sectional and hasn't been looked at over time. Resilience researchers have said, if you want to understand the process of resilience, you've got to understand the underlying mechanisms and processes. So we talk a little bit about how that should be done in the context of this work. Going back to the Kalief Browder example, institutional and cultural racism, thinking about the impacts of incarceration. Black women are one of the fastest increasing incarcerated groups. What implications does that have for a demographic where over half of the households are female-led? How does that impact marginalization experiences for youth whose parents are detained or who are in the justice system? Not just thinking about kind of the discrimination person-to-person experiences. Lifecourse perspective, okay? I would love to partner with any of you in here to think about how do we adapt some of these things in a child and adolescent center context. I think it would be an enormous contribution to the field because a lot of the work that's been done, as you saw, is kind of adult-centered. And really, we just got a grant. We're looking at African American and Latino populations in North Carolina and trying to understand how do racial health disparities develop over time. So everyone talks about, life expectancy gap, disease morbidity, et cetera. We have a little less understanding of what's going on over time. Are there critical periods during which, maybe like the transition to adulthood, when folks really increase their vulnerability to these types of experiences? Okay, biopsychosocial, we've got to study mind and body. They're both connected. I won't berate that point. Thinking about how we include racial ethnic risk and protective factors in clinical work. I'm a proponent. There are some somewhat decent measures for measuring racial discrimination and racism-related stress. It may be an idea to kind of assess the frequency with which folks have had these kinds of experiences since they're so common for youth and since we know they're associated with mental health outcomes. I also say, but attention to instrumentation. The measures are not perfect. They have some limitations, as many measures do. We've also considered, suggested to clinicians to think about assessing racial and ethnic identity during adolescence, because we know that it seems to be related to how you cope with these experiences. And our recent work, it seems to be related to youth psychological distress. Even when you take into account, and I haven't mentioned this point previously, these studies have taken into account general stress, okay? So it's not just the correlational effect. Even when you control for general stress youth are experiencing, you still get these effects. Finally, acknowledging that there are multiple identities here. We often talk about, African American youth or Latino youth, but there are multiple identities. There's gender, there's sexual orientation, the work in terms of understanding differences and how different identities intersect is woefully underdeveloped. There's some really interesting work that talks about differences between African American female and male adolescents, Black males. There's actually data showing that They go a lot further away from home base as they start becoming more independent. So the types of places they're going to be exposed to and the incidence of discrimination is likely to be larger than African American adolescent females who tend not to go as far when they're kind of going away from home. But African American females also deal with unique types of stressors as well. So thinking about how all those different types of identities go together. All right, so in conclusion, racism is bad. It constitutes a significant risk to the mental health functioning of racial and ethnic minority youth. Racial and ethnic protective factors are essential elements of African American youth's mental health hygiene. So we need to think about how can we incorporate these factors. And in terms of my big master plan, where I'm going with this is doing the basic research to understand how we can incorporate these things into evidence-based practice, taking into account race and culture and assessment, and the design and implementation of interventions can maximize the effectiveness and improve the health of all youth. Okay? A couple of quick acknowledgements here. Again, thanks to John and Amanda, who were very patient with me as I've gone through some recent challenges in working with me. So thank you, and acknowledgement of a couple other people here. Thank you very much.
It's not a question. I just wanted to thank you for bringing insight on something that's very important. A lot of people aren't aware of racism or the African American culture, what we go through, and you just provided a lot of education on something that's very insightful. This is my second year here, and I am so informed, and I'm so grateful to be able to even be in this room to even listen to what you're saying. So I would just want to thank you for being here, and thank you for...
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you again, Dr. Neblett. My question has to do with the definition of African American. When you look at racial identity, like down here in South Florida, for example, I'm working with two Afro-Cuban biracial girls, and I have another patient who is Haitian. Mm-hmm. His father's Haitian, mother is African American, and how they kind of conceptualize race and culture a little bit differently, mm-hmm. and also the issue of nationality. Mm-hmm. My children of biracial background or Cuban also identify as being Cuban. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that may look differently in different settings? And I know that's one of the areas that needs further research, but just a comment on that.
Yeah, most of the work that we've done has I don't have as direct experience with those intersectional identities, but in terms of thinking about exactly that point, nationality absolutely matters. There's extensive work, well, let me take that back, not extensive, but there are models that talk about biracial identity and having multiple identities, and as the population becomes increasingly multiracial, that's an absolute, there's recognition that a lot of the models tend to be monoracial. They don't really think about the intersection, but we know that it matters. There's some research that suggests that it's even more stressful having a biracial or bi-ethnic identity because you're in between, you feel like you don't fit here, you don't fit there, you're trying to find your place. Certain groups may reject you if you think about how you appear phenotypically. So all of these things, in addition to nationality, how you actually look, your skin tone, may play into the type of distress that you're experiencing.
Again, thank you for your talk, especially in this climate, the political climate that we're experiencing at this time. But I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned the Clark study. What is the oldest study on the identity that you've run across? I'm trying to gauge how the age of this field of studying this racial identity.
I would say the Clark and Clark is kind of the one that people tend to go to. I suspect there were probably folks looking at these types of issues before then, but it would certainly be 20th century. I mean, African American students weren't even permitted to go to graduate school until, the mid-1900s. So it would be around that same time period.
How you doing? My name is Sydney, and I just want to kind of say a comment, and then I guess have you talk a little bit more about some of the ethnic racial identity that you kind of talked about when it comes to parents and their children, and how there's a gap, I guess, when the parents are not really kind of talking about, this racial stressors that's going on, specifically around trust, and how maybe years ago, parents or African American parents may kind of put a system in place where they kind of have their kids, maybe hang around more people who are of their same background as a trust protective factor. But it seems like now they're kind of pushing away from that because a lot of them, there's maybe more, black on black or African American on African American crimes that's kind of happening. And now it seems like even Haitian parents or other nationalities as well are kind of just rather have their kids stay home, and they're kind of continuing this cycle of this negative talk that's happening when it comes to their same group. So I don't know if you want to just kind of talk a little bit about that trust factor and how that gap of when these kids are trying to kind of, connect with their same group, and sometimes the parents are not really always as supportive.
Yeah.
And the anxiety that happens with that, as you talk about the increase that happens with, the anxiety that's happening with these African American kids.
Yeah. These youth that we're working with in Southeast Raleigh, we, I don't think it was a mistake, but where we started was talking with youth and their parents in the room together. And the parents started out the conversation, they jumped right in and they said, we need help. We really don't know. We're so confused. I've got stuff going on at work that's related to racism. I don't know if I should be talking with my kids about this. The youth said, gosh, when our parents talk about this, they seem so angry, and we can't even get a word in edgewise. We can't talk about how we feel about it. We need some way to help us kind of manage these communications. So that your comment made me think a little bit about that. In terms of the piece, yeah, there's evidence, particularly among certain ethnicities that are not African American, but like West Indian, and many, West Indian youth report they're getting messages from their parents about not interacting with African Americans. That's not true for all, it's a generalization, but it's not uncommon to hear that. I haven't done research on that, but you could imagine, consistent with what you suggested, that would be kind of jarring if you're in a culture where your friends may be African American and you're getting these messages from your parents that are kind of in conflict. It's the similar thing I was talking about a few moments ago in terms of bicultural identity and trying to find your place and being conflicted and experiencing distress because you're getting all kinds of messages that don't all go together, if that makes sense.
Because for them, a lot of stuff that's going on, again, with deportation and things like that, they just kind of want to stay away from anything or any trouble. So a lot of times you may hear parents say that, we're your best friends, or we're all the friends that you need, or keep it in the family and things like that, where, again, just kind of echoing this whole thing that, they're trying to shelter them and, put them in a place where, hey, this is a protective factor, not really understanding how it is causing increased anxiety in their child, because again, their child is trying to, what they're supposed to do at that age is kind of, have this friendship and build on this friendship, this socialness.
Move away from,
yeah,
sort of the autonomy piece.
Yeah, so I think it's important. I think, like you said, like the racial trauma and things like that, these terminologies that you use, is good to kind of educate the parents and to bring the greater awareness when that is apparent.
Yeah, agreed. Okay. Feel free to find me wherever. I'll be here a few days. Thank you.